April morning. In the transparent haze, familiar silhouettes of warships, still icebound in the harbours, were clearly outlined. In the distant chime of deck jars, in the singing of ships' horns, the first spring drop was persistently and rhythmically intertwined. Kronstadt, always austere and trim, lived an ordinary measured life. On the streets, squares and embankment walls, military sailors walked. People in civilian clothes met less often. The frozen narrow canals in the Obomshalom granite kept the memory of the old Peter the Great times, and the shrouded guns on the steel hulks of battleships and cruisers seemed to look into tomorrow's formidable day. The whole appearance of the fortress city bore the stamp of business and power, the glorious past and the greatness of the present. On this clear golden morning in early April 1940, I, as usual, came with a folder and maps for the next report to the commander of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet, Vice Admiral Vladimir Filipovich Tributes. In the ancient office, everything reminded of the fleet and dark blue, the colour of the wave, the walls, and hanging on them maps of the Baltic theatre, and faded by time, pictures of naval battles. Everything here was familiar and habitual. I had known the owner of the office for a long time, back when I was still studying at the Naval Academy. Lively, energetic, impetuous, he was somehow absent-minded and thoughtful that morning. Glancing at me, the commander said curtly, almost dryly, "There is important news. Germany has invaded Denmark. The Germans landed in Norway and occupied it." In the silence that followed, one could hear the thawed ice flakes breaking off the roof and falling to the ground. The pendulum of an antique clock ticked moderately and clearly. My report was brief. I briefly reported on how the ships were repaired, gave letters for signature, instructions to flag officers on current affairs. Comflot signed and, going through some telegrams, thought, apparently about something else, still distant, but very important and alarming. I was also thinking about many things. In September 1938, the shameful Munich Agreement of the Western powers with Hitler unleashed his hands for further aggressions. Having soon occupied Czechoslovakia, in March 1939 he seized the Klaipeda region from Lithuania and immediately began to establish a naval base there. This was a direct threat to our strategic position in the Baltic and could not but worry the Soviet government, which was firmly determined to defend the national independence of the Baltic states and its northwestern borders against fascist aggression. However, the bourgeois rulers of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, supported by the Western powers, rudely rejected all offers of assistance and guarantees from the USSR. Not only that, in June of the same year, contrary to our warnings and the law of neutrality, they signed friendly treaties with Hitler's Germany. Tallinn, Riga and Kaunas were visited by guests from Berlin, in particular by the Chief of Staff of the German Land Forces, Golda, and the Chief of Nazi Intelligence, Canaris. The Western leaders urged Hitler against the Soviet Union, but the Führer was primarily plotting then the capture of Poland and strikes on France and England. A premature invasion of the Baltics could derail these plans. The Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact, concluded in August 1939, confused the cards of the local fascist bosses, who were counting on German military aid. The governments of the Baltic states were forced in September-October of the same year to sign with the Soviet Union the treaties of mutual assistance offered to them. We were given the opportunity to base fleet formations in the ports of Tallinn, Paldiski, Riga, Vindava and Libava. Our aviation was given a number of airfields. The treaties gave us the right to establish a coastal defense system to protect our bases and islands. The Soviet army was allowed to have its garrisons in a number of areas of the Baltic. The Finnish government, under German pressure, delayed similar negotiations in every possible way, provoked a war with the USSR, and only after suffering a complete defeat in it, accepted all our demands in March 1940. The islands of the middle and eastern part of the Gulf of Finland were ceded to us. The peninsula of Hanko was leased to the USSR. The land border with Finland was moved to the west of Viborg. Henceforth, the entrance to the Gulf of Finland was reliably blocked by the multi-layer fire of our coastal batteries established on Dago, Odinsholm, and a number of other islands in the Gulf of Finland and on the Hanko Peninsula. The open corridor through the Baltic Sea, and the Gulf of Finland to Leningrad was thus taken under reliable protection. The long and persistent struggle for a peaceful solution of the question of the security of our northwestern borders seemed to have ended in a complete victory for Soviet policy. The workers of the Baltic states welcomed the conclusion of treaties with the USSR and demanded further rapprochement with their great eastern neighbour. This frightened the pro-fascist elements in the governments of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. They strengthened economic ties with Germany, bought weapons from it, and took all measures to diminish the importance of treaties with the USSR. At secret meetings of the chiefs of general staff of the Baltic countries, with representatives of the German High Command, measures directed against our country were discussed. Unbridled anti-Soviet articles appeared in the press. Some of our servicemen began to disappear. Numerous repressions were carried out against persons who took part in servicing the units of the Red Army and Navy. Local authorities made it difficult for us to canton our teams on the shore and to base our ships. Both in Tallinn and in Libava, I repeatedly witnessed such diplomatic complications. Once our tugboat with a barge was returning to Tallinn in a fresh wind. Fearing to collide with the warships in the cramped harbour allotted to us under the agreement, the tugboat captain correctly decided to stand down in the commercial port. Immediately in the office of our senior naval chief, Rear Admiral V. A. Alafuzov, a telephone call sounded. "Mr. Admiral," spoke the assistant of the Estonian Minister of War, "your tugboat stood at the berth not assigned to you." Putting down the telephone receiver, the Admiral sighed. "They are ready to scandalize on every trifle. Yesterday, one of the sailors in the yard of the barracks took the allegedly wrong log immediately a call from the Ministry of War. And so on for every reason." Meanwhile, our armed forces punctually observed all the terms of the treaties, and the Soviet government rightly demanded the same from the governments of the Baltic states. But its repeated appeals to them in this respect have led to nothing. Not only that, we learned that the Estonian General Staff was passing intelligence information about our fleet and army to the Finns, and even organised the sending of volunteers to Finland, which in 1839 had begun military operations against the USSR. The pro-fascist cliques of Estonia and Latvia demanded even more open participation in the war on the side of Finland. This is how the ruling circles of the Baltic countries understood the law on neutrality and the Treaty on Mutual Assistance with the USSR. The seizure of Denmark and Norway by German troops, as Vice Admiral Tributes informed me in the April morning, further complicated the situation in the Baltic and at our northwestern borders. There was something to think about. All the actions of Hitler's German government did not speak in any way about peacefulness, about the desire to honestly honor the obligations assumed under the treaty with the USSR. Fascist intelligence, especially air reconnaissance, became clearly insolent. Its sorties became more and more frequent. And we were terribly sorry that we had no right to fire at German reconnaissance planes that appeared over the territory of Latvia and Estonia. We were allowed to shoot at them only within the old USSR border, i.e., only east of the Narva Bay. Hello, Tallinn. The pro-fascist policy of the bourgeoisie met with increasingly sharp resistance from the workers of the Baltic countries. They insistently demanded the establishment of popular front governments. Mass political demonstrations and strikes took place under this slogan. The movement of the masses was led by communists who came out of the underground left socialists and progressive social organizations, spoke in defense of the vested national interests. But the local fascists were brazen. Emboldened by Hitler's duplicitous, treacherous tactics towards the USSR, they waited for German soldiers to enter the Baltics, and they clamoured for power. The ruling circles of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania indulged them. It became obvious that our northwestern border was still unreliably covered. This overflowed the cup of patience of the Soviet government. On June 14, 1940, demands were made to Lithuania, and 2 days later to Estonia and Latvia, to form such governments as could enforce all the clauses of the Mutual Aid Treaty. In addition, we demanded that a sufficient number of our troops be allowed into the territory of the Baltic states in order to suppress all fascist intrigues against the national independence of the Baltic peoples and the combat effectiveness of the Soviet garrisons. The pro-fascist ringleaders fled to Germany. People's Front governments were established in the Baltic republics, including Estonia. Now it became possible to relocate the Baltic Fleet Command from Kronstadt to Tallinn. Since the spring of 1940, Admiral N.G. Kuznetsov, People's Commissar of the Navy, had been insistently demanding this from us. And in fact, large compounds of submarine and surface ships have long been based in Tallinn, Riga, Libava, and the Military Council and Fleet headquarters remained, as if in the deep rear, far from the area where the huge construction of new naval bases, airfields and coastal defence facilities were deployed. The transfer of the command to the capital of Estonia had to be carried out in such a way that the fleet management was not interrupted for a minute. It was not an easy task. A lot of work had to be done by the head of the operational department of the headquarters, Captain First Rank G. E. Pilipovsky, and the head of fleet communications, Colonel M.M.E.A. Zernov, to cope with it. The new Soviet-built passenger ship Siberia, running on the line Leningrad-London, was equipped as a staff ship and equipped with all necessary and possible, at that time, means of communication. At the same time in Kronstadt and in Tallinn at the coastal command posts were organised special operational duty, which duplicated all orders and reports transmitted to the flagship command post on the Siberia. On June 20th, Siberia came to Tallinn and stood at the wall of the Main harbour. The headquarters of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet settled in one of the best buildings of the Estonian capital, near Vyshgorod, next to the premises of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the government of the Republic. There, too, in the centre of the city, in a small house, was the Estonian War Ministry, where I went a few days later on an official visit to the minister. Narrow stairs, small windows, cleanliness and silence everywhere, as if in a private apartment whose inhabitants had gone to work. A young blonde lieutenant met me at the entrance and silently led me into the minister's office, a modest, sparingly furnished room with a low ceiling. The minister, Major General Tones Rothberg, a stout, balding, short Estonian, wore an English army uniform. He smiled and greeted me with a few phrases befitting the occasion. I replied in the same spirit. The minister further requested that if the headquarters had any needs and questions beyond the limits stipulated in the treaty, to solve all these questions through him, the minister, or through his assistant, so as not to create any conflicts on the ground. However, Mr. Admiral, soon everything will change, and you will be the masters here, the general added sadly, and looked at me with a sly questioning look, squinting his already small eyes. I answered without hurry that the fleet command and the staff will certainly observe all the clauses of the agreement on our stay in Estonia, and I am not aware of any change or extension of the agreement. The minister did not develop this slippery subject, and I did not even more so. The visit was short and minor. It seems that on the second or third day after the visit, the commander of the Estonian Navy came to me with a return visit, a tall, slender blonde man with an open, friendly face and mild manners. His rank of Captain Major, judging by 3 patches, apparently corresponded to our rank of Captain of the 3rd rank. The Estonian Comflot spoke more simply and clearly than his Minister of War. After the formal greetings, he asked me directly, "Mr. Admiral, when are we going to hoist the Soviet naval flags? We find them very beautiful. And in organizational terms, it is somehow difficult for 2 fleets to stand in the same port. We are ready for it." After the conversation with the Minister of War, Comflot's question did not take me by surprise. This kind of thoughts obviously were not accidental in Estonian military leaders. As I later learned from Rear Admiral P. A. Trainin, who was in Libava at that time, the commander of the Latvian fleet also addressed him with a similar question. I expressed to my interlocutor my deep satisfaction that Estonian sailors like our navy flag, but whether they will hoist it on their ships is for them to decide. The Captain Major seemed to miss my words and, saying goodbye, convincingly asked me to warn him at least a day in advance to bring all the ships and crews to festive parade look. On the part of Estonian sailors and officers we saw in a number of cases, undoubtedly, a benevolent attitude towards us. But it would be naive to extend such a judgment to all locals. And we were soon, unfortunately, convinced of it. One day the window panes rattled from distant but strong explosions. "There's a big fire in the harbour at the oil depot," we were told. Already sitting in the car, we and the chief of Baltic Fleet. Belsky soon saw the columns of thick black smoke rising high above the small houses of the Havana district. Bright long tongues of flame occasionally broke through the smoke. From all the streets people were pouring to the harbour, bells were ringing, fire sirens were blaring. People, cars all rushed to the fire. The smell of oil was pungent, soot was in the air. From the bridge of the headquarters ship Siberia, which stood in Mine Harbour, clearly visible were large silver tanks, embraced on all sides of the flames. The burning oil was already spreading beyond the warehouses, threatening the ships. The day, unfortunately, was hot and almost calm. It was difficult to breathe in the smoky air. The situation was very difficult. Calling all tugs, I ordered the ships to leave the harbour immediately. Having given all the necessary instructions, we went to the burning warehouses on the windward side, where it was not so stuffy, and where our crews arrived at the alarm. The warehouses had exploded in several places at the same time, instead of in one, as happens in an accident. It was obvious that we were dealing with a clear sabotage. This was openly spoken of in the crowd, some with anger and some with ill-concealed gloating. All the fire departments of the city, workers from a neighbouring factory, soldiers and sailors from Estonian ships participated in the fight against the fire. All of them, like our people, acted heroically. The extinguishing of the enormous fire was energetically and efficiently led by the commander of the Estonian Navy. Soon the Minister of War arrived at the fire. "General," I addressed him, "this is not exactly a friendly greeting to the Soviet fleet, which has just arrived in Tallinn." The minister frowned and mumbled. "I have ordered an immediate investigation. The causes of the explosions are not yet known." But the flames raging in different parts of the warehouse and the ominous spilling of burning oil spoke for themselves. The investigation, of course, yielded nothing. The fire was extinguished late in the evening. Fortunately, none of the workers, soldiers and sailors were injured. Extraordinary incidents of all kinds were repeated. Apparently we had many hidden enemies in bourgeois nationalist Estonia. It was clear that the fascist elements that had survived in the Baltics were preparing a putsch and wanted to turn back the wheel of history. The working people of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania did not want to put up with this. The working people of Estonia saw in the Red Army and Red Banner Baltic soldiers their friends and liberators from fascist bourgeois oppression, defenders of their freedom and national independence. In those days I had the opportunity to observe many exciting scenes in the streets and enterprises of Tallinn, the citadel of the Estonian workers' movement. I remember the stormy, crowded workers' meetings in the evening of June 20th. The orators demanded the establishment of a new, popular government, friendship with the Soviet Union, and the decisive uprooting of all elements hostile to it from the state apparatus. And on the morning of June 21st, the workers of Tallinn left their factories and plants and marched to the centre of the city. On the way, the demonstrators warmly greeted the Soviet soldiers, and with special warmth they met our Red Fleet soldiers. A delegation of workers of the textile factory Elchak presented the commander of the sailors' detachment with a letter of greeting. It was a grand demonstration of friendship with the Soviet Union. On its red banners were repeated thousands of times the battle slogans: "We demand a government that will honestly honour the treaty made with the Soviet Union. We demand work for the workers, bread and freedom." With these demands, the participants of the 40,000-strong rally in Victory Square marched to the presidential palace in Kadriorg, and then to Tumpi Castle, where they freed the political prisoners held there. Having occupied the arsenal, the workers armed themselves. By the end of the day, a crowded rally was again held near Vyshgorod, and at 6:45 p.m. A red flag was raised on the ancient tower Long Herman. The Pats clique had been overthrown, and the Estonian people had won a historic victory. The Estonian Communist Party, which had been underground for 22 years, now openly led the movement of the masses of the people who sought to walk hand in hand with the peoples of the Soviet Union on the road to building socialism. Under her leadership, the workers of Estonia began preparations for the elections to the new State Duma. The activity of the masses, long restrained, now burst forth. Trade unions, workers' organizations, units of popular self-defense were created. All the progressive forces of the country united in the Union of the Working People of Estonia. The workers of Tallinn, soldiers and sailors of the Estonian Army and Navy gathered in the central square for a grand pre-election rally. The revolutionary battle banners of 1905 and 1917, which had been hidden from the police for many years, were flying above them. The elections to the State Duma ended with the complete victory of the Union of Estonian Working People, and on July 21 and 22, at its sessions, historic decisions were made on the establishment of Soviet power in the Republic, on its accession to the Soviet Union, on the proclamation of land as the property of the people, on the nationalization of banks and large industry. A group of Baltic sailors, speaking at this historic meeting, welcomed the Estonian People's Duma and in its person the entire Estonian people. A few days later, the deputies of the People's Duma were guests of the Soviet submariners. The overthrow of bourgeois power in Estonia not only ended the fascist regime in the country, but also freed it from the heavy and shameful yoke of foreign capital and brought true freedom and independence to the Estonian people. In the same direction, events developed in the other Baltic republics, Latvia and Lithuania, which in the same days restored the power of the Soviets and joined the Soviet Union. On the last Sunday of July, 1940, our country, as always, celebrated the Day of the Navy. On the Baltic, this national holiday was especially solemn. For the first time, Estonians saw the powerful Red Banner Baltic Fleet on the Tallinn roadstead. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers and submarines were anchored with flags of colour. Their formidable guns and torpedo apparatuses threatened no one. There were rowing and sailing races between the crews, and by the gala dinner our guests arrived to the ship's officers and sailors of the Estonian Navy, who quickly became friends with the Soviet sailors. On the battleship Marat, the senior guest was the Estonian Minister of War, already familiar to me. Music was blaring on the ships. Dozens of dinghies were launching at the stern of the battleship. White sails, like seagulls, were soaring above the blue sea. A light northwest moderated the heat and barely swayed the ship's flags. In August, the Soviet Baltic republics reunited with the USSR. Their national military units joined the troops of the new Baltic Special Military District, and their navies joined the Red Banner Baltic Fleet. Now it seemed one could be calm for the corridor along the Baltic Sea, through the Gulf of Finland to Leningrad and for our northwestern borders. The further depended on how we had time to strengthen our coasts and islands in the Baltic. After all, the length of our border on the Baltic Sea increased by 1,740 kilometers. German and French naval attaches visited me. They were leaving, because their embassies under the governments of the Baltic republics were henceforth liquidated. I gave both of them modest farewell breakfasts. The German was a captain of the second rank, gaunt, middle-aged, soft-spoken, reserved. He was immaculately dressed, with orders and a sword. He answered my slippery questions evasively, or even just kept silent, chewing sandwiches. "Tell me, Mr. Captain of the second rank, how would you react if a warplane of a foreign power appeared over your unit?" After 3 or 4 shots of good Soviet cognac, it was already possible to ask such a little diplomatic question. Von Sander muttered something like, "Oh, yes, yes," smiled coldly, twirled the shot glass in 2 fingers for a long time, and as if searching for words, answered, "I would certainly have carried out the instructions on this occasion of my senior superior." The answer was clear, and there was no point in asking again. Apparently, my interlocutor knew well the instructions of his superiors. The visit was short, and we parted coldly. The French attaché, a captain of the first rank, came to me in a surcoat without orders, but with a sword. A full, elderly man, he was very friendly, and like all Frenchmen, obliging and of course talkative. We sat for a long time, as long as the norms of diplomatic time allowed. The lively conversation at breakfast was skillfully supported by Major N.S. Frumkin. The attaché began it directly with the problems of a possible war. "Mr. Admiral, do not believe a word of Hitler. Fascists are beasts. They are bandits. I love the Russian people. I know your country well. That's why I tell you so. Hitler will deceive you and attack you. Be ready for it. Czechoslovakia is dead. My poor France is suffering humiliation. In the voice of the French officer was felt sincere sorrow. We parted amicably. Our conversation was recorded by Major NS Frumkin almost verbatim and reported back to Moscow. Yes, we did not want to believe in the possibility of war, but we were obliged to think about it, and most importantly, to prepare for it, although the most peaceful instructions came from the General Staff. In the fall of 1940, we held a large exercise. It involved all units of the fleet, aviation and coastal defence. For the first time, the Baltic saw its Red Banner fleet in full. We practiced one of the most important tasks, the defence of the mouth of the Gulf of Finland from penetration into it possible enemy. This exercise was conducted in our own waters and on our own shores. It went well, without any excesses on the part of our neighbours, but no sooner had the commanders of the main naval staff left, and the ships went to their bases, as at the next report our omniscient chief of intelligence, N.S. Frumkin, informed us that Germany had concluded an agreement with Finland on the right to transport its troops through its territory to Kirkenes. It means that Finland violated its obligations assumed under the peace treaty with the USSR, concluded only 6 months ago. This was clearly not a friendly act towards us. Why did neutral Finland need fascist troops? Very soon it was confirmed that from Stettin by sea German transports with troops went to Helsinki, Vashi Uleåborg, Turku under the protection of warships and aviation. It also became known that in mid-October 10,000 German soldiers arrived in Finland from Vadsö. Until deep winter, until the harbours froze, the Nazis were intensively transferring troops under the escort of icebreakers from Germany to Finland. About this continuously received reports from our ships and airplanes. Clouds were gathering over the Baltic. At the same time, Hitler continued to speak on the radio and in the press, professing his loyalty to the Soviet Union. But the facts spoke quite differently. Some detent in the complex and anxious situation that reigned in those days in the Baltics brought one event at the beginning of the new year, 1941. On the morning of January 11th, my deputy captain, first rank Nikolai Alexievich Petersky, came into the office and solemnly put a fresh issue of Pravda on the table. Here, Comrade Admiral, read this wonderful document. A blow to the fascist agents. Well done. I dive into the lines scrawled in red pencil. The newspaper reports that the USSR has signed an agreement with Germany on the resettlement of German citizens and persons of German nationality from Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia to Germany. Yes, I agreed. This is indeed a blow to the fascist fifth column. Later, one of the prominent bourgeois intelligence specialists wrote that the Soviet government's action was a formidable disaster for the German military attaché in Moscow. We did not, however, overestimate the magnitude of this defeat of the Nazi agency in the Baltics. And indeed, soon German intelligence became more active, apparently seeking to compensate for the damage it had suffered. Violations of our state border began from the end of 1940, but since February 1941 German planes began to appear continuously over our border areas and naval bases. We were also alarmed by information from the headquarters of the Leningrad military district about a significant concentration of German troops on the Soviet land border. In such a tense situation was our first winter of 1940/41 in Tallinn. We, the commanders of the staff, even then perfectly understood what a serious threat hanging over our homeland and sought to maximize the combat readiness of the fleet. The work in the headquarters was boiling from morning until late at night. I could rely on my closest assistants. The soul of the staff collective was its party organization. Relying on it, my deputy for political affairs, Regimental Commissar Sidorov, persistently and skillfully fostered in each communist sense of responsibility for their work. Yellowed, faded sheets of my workbook bring back in memory some moments of activity of our headquarters in those days. In winter, at the beginning of 1941, we checked the operational readiness of all the main headquarters and formations of the fleet. we developed instructions for the defence of the mouth of the Gulf of Finland by the forces of the entire fleet in cooperation with aviation, and to ensure the exit and entry of submarines from the bases. March and April brought a new complication of the situation. The German fleet in those months conducted its combat training already in the middle part of the Baltic Sea. Its submarines appeared near our naval base of Libava. In early April, the battleship Bismarck was seen near it. Later, the cruiser Admiral Hipper with 3 destroyers and 5 submarines conducted exercises in the area of Klaipėda, near the Soviet border. All this in no way indicated a friendly attitude of Germany to the USSR. The conclusions were self-evident. Staff report, approved by the commander and sent to Moscow, critically and truthfully covered the state of readiness of the Baltic Fleet. In particular, it spoke of a significant shortage of minesweepers and other significant shortcomings in our preparation for a possible war. This was not the first report of this kind. Thus, back in August 1940, the fleet staff reported to the Chief Naval Staff about the need to create land defences of bases, especially Hanko and Libava. In April, we checked the state of combat training of sea border guards. Major General M.I. Moskalenko, the chief of the rear, held an interesting game, during which many of our faults were revealed. It turned out, for example, that our new bases lacked storage facilities for liquid fuel. Our tanker fleet was small in number, having only 4 ships. We also checked the condition of the fleet's railroad artillery. The word war was not yet officially pronounced anywhere by us, but many people understood perfectly well the tension of the situation. Only in April and May the Germans through the port of Turku transported to Finland about 43,000 soldiers. Some of them settled in Rovaniemi, the rest settled much further east, closer to the Soviet border. All transports followed under heavy guard of destroyers and airplanes, although Germany was not at war with anyone in the Baltic. Hitler's ships and airplanes since spring 1941 began to conduct reconnaissance of our bases and coasts quite openly and brazenly, violating all norms of international law. Unknown submarines were again seen near Libava, Dago Island, and even near Seskar Island. On May 7th, the permission of the Chief Naval Staff was received to establish in the mouth of the Gulf of Finland and at the naval bases ship watches. But the spring was prolonged, the bay was still covered with ice. Only in the second half of May we were able to send a ship's watch to the approaches to Urbensky Strait. The submarine S-7 went there. On May 27th, the submarine Sheish 309 took a watch position in the mouth of the Gulf of Finland. On the approaches to Hanko, Libava, Tallinn and Kronstadt base patrols were also put out. Brazen provocations of fascist intelligence, continued in the air, at sea and on land, prompted the fleet to disperse ships in case of a surprise attack. In the second half of May, all cruisers and destroyers of the Light Force Detachment, as well as most of the submarines and their mothership, were transferred from Libava to Ust-Divinsk, where the air defence was somewhat stronger. From Libava to Tallinn went the minesweeper OK, and from Tallinn to Kronstadt the battleship Marat. With a group of commanders of the fleet headquarters, I went to Riga to discuss a number of operational issues together with the headquarters of the newly formed Baltic Special Military District. Together with my army comrades, we sat for a long time over the map. Only 8 months had passed after the Baltic republics had joined the Soviet Union. One cannot do much in such a short period of time. Fortifications at the new borders are still being built. The district lacked troops and equipment tanks, anti-aircraft artillery, airplanes. The army complained that slowly rebuild airfields for new types of aircraft. This work is being done by NKVD organizations, which are impossible to influence. They are subordinate only to Beria. We also have a lot of deficiencies. Slowly built coastal batteries. New bases for the fleet are still at the stage of organization. By the way, we were able to start creating a naval base in Riga only on May 25, 1941. Keep your eyes open. And the data of our intelligence were more and more alarming. German submarines, torpedo boats, minesweepers, patrol ships and destroyers were arriving in Finnish ports. The German airstrikes occupied a number of southern and eastern airfields of Finland. Once a fascist seaplane was circling over Libava. Its engine went haywire, and the pilot landed the machine on the water, almost at the harbour. German attempts to start the engine failed. A Soviet boat approached the plane. The pilots were arrested, all documents and maps were taken from them, and the airplane was towed to the shore. The incident was immediately reported to Moscow. What was our general surprise when about an hour later Komflot received by telephone an order to provide the pilots with full assistance in repairing the engine, to supply them with fuel and food, not to take anything away from them, to feed them, to release them from custody immediately and let them go to all four sides. The order, of course, had to be carried out. The Germans had a dense lunch, thanked us for the repair and help, and by evening, having flapped their wings, were already at home. It was not easy for our political workers to explain to people such complacency by the desire not to complicate relations with Germany. After all, in the area of the same Libava, our border guards in the middle of June observed with a simple eye large tank exercises on the other side of the border. It became known that in Memel concentrated up to 400 German tanks, and in the fleet headquarters, and in the wardrooms of ships' commanders vividly discussed the events of the past few days. A large group of German marine engineers, who were supervising the completion of the hull of the ship we bought in Germany, left Leningrad without any reason. Then, without any intelligible explanation, technical supplies for this ship were stopped. Finally, it became known that all German steamships urgently leave the port of Leningrad, and after June 14th, no more transports from Germany are expected to come to us. All the more strange seemed the appearance on the streets of Tallinn of several fascist officers in full uniform. "What's the matter?" they kept asking us over the telephone. We had to calmly explain that, with the permission of our authorities, a German schooner had arrived on the island of Isle to transport to Germany the ashes of German soldiers buried there, once in the distant past. Of course, the rules of the border regime were observed, but the very presence of the Nazis in those days on Isle was not desirable at all. In many places of the island, the construction of coastal defence batteries was intensified, necessary materials and parts were brought in large quantities, roads were laid. Of course, it was impossible to hide all this from the experienced eye of a scout who was openly travelling across the island to Tallinn. Both the military council and the fleet headquarters saw and understood that Germany was now openly preparing for war with the Soviet Union. We had to keep our eyes open. Since June 16th, we established a ship watch at the entrance to the Gulf of Finland and on the line Cape Tarkuna-Hanko. At the insistence of the head of the mine and torpedo department of the rear, Captain Second Rank Popik, we towed from Kronstadt a Blockschiff, an old ship, converted to a floating warehouse with a stock of barrage mines. We checked the combat readiness of our two minesweepers with special care. At the warehouses were tireless training. Sailors learned to quickly load mines on the ships. In advance was developed and approved the entire system of convoy service. It was extremely important, because the Moonsund Islands and the naval base Hanko were supplied only by sea. No less important were the sea routes connecting our new bases in the Baltic with the rear of the fleet in the east, with Kronstadt. It was decided to complete submarine formations with the same type of ships. The boats under construction and overhaul boats were brought together in a separate brigade. All this greatly facilitated the management of the submarine fleet. Quiet Tallinn early sank into a night's slumber. Nowhere in the windows have long seen the light. Only until late at night brightly gleamed light's big house of the fleet headquarters. For a long time lingered in my office my closest assistants, the operator Grigory Efimovich Pilipovsky, the head of combat training fleet Sergei Valentinovich Kudryavtsev, and my deputy Nikolai Alexeyevich Petersky. The deputy head of the political propaganda department, Brigade Commissar Vasily Vasilievich Karyakin, always calm and focused, often visited us in the evenings. We all appreciated his great erudition and sincerely respected him. In our late conversations we summarized what we had done, and the question arose again, was the fleet ready for the impending formidable events? As I have already said, with the entry of the Baltic republics into the USSR in August 1940, the strategic situation in the Baltic Sea has improved for us. However, in order to realize all our strategic advantages, time was needed first of all. In Libava, Vindava, Riga, Paldiski and Tallinn, as well as on the islands of the Moonsund archipelago, Gogland Island, on Hanko and in the Gulf of Vyborg, it was necessary to build fleet bases and create a reliable artillery defence for them from the sea and from the air. All this grandiose construction was scheduled for completion in 1943 to 1946, and it is obvious that by June 1941 could be realised only a small part of it. The construction of airfields for the fleet aviation required a wide scope. Before the full implementation of all these plans was still far away, and the fleet, deployed according to the new situation, relied so far on completely unequipped bases that had no land defences. In the years before the war, after the XVII Congress of the Party, the Soviet Navy was on the rise. In 1940 alone, 100 warships were built, and in 1941 at various factories of the country were in the construction of 269 warships of various classes. Some of them managed to enter into service before the war. Cruisers were built mainly for the Black Sea and the Pacific Ocean. The Baltic received most of the destroyers and torpedo boats. Unfortunately, the least of all built minesweepers and patrol ships. We lagged behind in the part of minesweeping, acoustics and radar, but in the past the mine work in the Russian Navy was at a high level. Foreign sailors learned from Russian minesweepers. The fleet lacked auxiliary ships, water carriers, tankers, transports, tugs and even barges. For the entire fleet we had only 4 tankers and 2 Aquarius. The coastal defence of the new western areas received from industry excellent guns of all calibres, as well as fire control equipment. Our batteries were built, as a rule, outside populated areas on islands and coasts where there were no roads, which was always associated with very labour-intensive preparatory work. New naval bases did not have the necessary amount of anti-aircraft artillery. They were not provided with repair facilities and fuel depots. A lot of time was required to master new ships and coastal batteries, to train their personnel. And of course, by the beginning of the war, not all of them were brought to combat perfection. But by the summer of 1941, the main Baltic Fleet formations were well prepared and equipped with quite modern equipment and weapons. This was the case at the squadron, which was commanded by Rear Admiral D. V. Dovichenko, in the detachment of light forces under the command of Rear Admiral V.P. Drozd in the submarine brigades of Captain 1st Rank N.P. Egyptco and Captain 2nd Rank A. Eagle, as well as in the brigades of torpedo boats, which were headed by Captains 2nd Rank V. S. Cherokov and V.A. Solomatin, and in a number of other compounds. Despite the weakness of anti-aircraft artillery, our ships were better than the German. Everyone was convinced of this after the first combat encounters. Excellent, well-trained personnel had and aviation of the Baltic Fleet, which was commanded by Major General V.V. Ermochenkov, but its material and technical equipment was much worse, although in 1940 it was significantly replenished, but mainly by aircraft of obsolete types. New bombers and fighters, created by that time by the Soviet industry, began to arrive to the units little by little only in 1941. By the beginning of the war, the Baltic Fleet still consisted mostly of obsolete machines, with less than a quarter of strike aircraft. The lack of fighters in the fleet aviation significantly limited the actions of ships at sea away from the coast. In addition, 80% of the air forces of the Baltic still remained on the old eastern airfields, remote from the new bases of the fleet and from the likely areas of maritime operations. On April 10, 1941, I reported to the Chief of the Main Naval Staff after another violation of our air boundaries anti-aircraft artillery does not reach the German planes, and fighters lag behind in speed. It was a cry of the soul. We had some wonderful people. Many of them were severely tested in the war with the White Finns. The ranks of sailors were reliably cemented by a powerful party organisation of the fleet. The unity of tactical thinking of the command staff was greatly facilitated by the new battle regulations of the fleet and the Manual on the Conduct of Naval Operations, published in the pre-war years. These basic operational and tactical documents concentrated the long-term experience of our personnel and life-tested theoretical provisions of the Soviet naval art. About the forces of our probable enemy in the Baltic theatre we had quite accurate information and could easily compare his capabilities with ours. In June 1941, in the German bases in the Baltic Sea and in Norway were 1 battleship, 4 cruisers, 34 destroyers, about 80 submarines, and a large number of torpedo and patrol boats. To this must be added 71 warships of the Finnish fleet, which had 2 battleships coastal defence, 5 submarines, minesweepers and torpedo boats. As you can see, the forces are considerable, although former Nazi admirals in their memoirs and write now that Hitler allegedly did not intend to keep a powerful fleet in the Baltic. The fascist fleet had an extensive network of bases, quite equipped and well covered by a system of naval and anti-aircraft batteries, and our new bases in the Baltic were not ready to receive and service the fleet. We were also worried about the most important sea communication between Kronstadt and Tallinn. It passed through the relatively narrow Gulf of Finland, stretched from west to east. The whole northern shore of the Gulf of Finland from Viborg belonged to Finland. This coast was cut by a dense network of skerries with a large number of closed bays, equipped ports and bases. Inner skerry fairways, invisible from the sea, provided a hidden manoeuvre of the Finnish fleet and the possibility of its sudden appearance on our communications. We had no fairways hidden from observation from the sea. Navigational hazards limited navigation in the bay to strictly defined courses. On our southern shore we had neither ports nor bays for at least temporary but reliable shelter for ships on the passage. It was clear to us that we had to be on our guard. That is why far past midnight the windows of the headquarters were glowing. Close to our building adjoined the House of Political Propaganda Department of the KBF. Its chief was then an old Baltic sailor, an experienced political worker Pyotr Ivanovich Belsky. Always calm, cheerful, witty, he skillfully established joint work of these 2 leading fleet management bodies. All issues were solved jointly, the case argued. The commander ordered me to check in detail the preparation of the flagship shore command post, pre-equipped outside the city in a sheltered place. Almost a whole day we were there with the Chief of Fleet Communications, Colonel Zernov, and Staff Officer Captain 2nd Rank Bogdanov. The command post, all its lines of communication, radio, telegraph and telephone were in full readiness. Everything necessary was brought there, up to fuel for the kitchen. The headquarters of the Air Force and Coastal Defence were ordered to make a similar quiet inspection of their command posts. A few days later I flew to Leningrad to coordinate some issues with the headquarters of the Leningrad Military District. Major General D.N. Nikishev, Chief of Staff, I found him in an excited state. Look what is being done. Holding a few telegrams he had just received, he brought me to the map here. Border posts have been removed by the Finns along the whole border. Ours are fallen down and broken. Finnish border guards and all the local population have gone inland. The border is open. This is war. Officers were ceaselessly entering the office. Telephones were ringing. People were busy. I tried to finish my business as quickly as possible. Our seaplane MBR-2 flew leisurely over the surface of the bay. Not a cloud in the sky. On the left and right shores were visible, but the right shore finish did not seem cosy and friendly. Having safely landed at the sea airdrome and quickly reached the headquarters, I reported to the Navy Military Council that the headquarters of the Leningrad Military District had no doubts about the reality of the war. At the time of my report, I received a report that since morning Nazi planes were again flying continuously at low altitude over Libava and its vicinity. Border guards reported that the concentration of German troops on the border was continuing. A young lieutenant colonel, the chief of staff of the border troops detachment, was waiting for me in the reception room. His face was preoccupied. Entering the office, he reported that in recent days an unprecedented number of border violators have been detained. They come from the sky, they come on foot, they come out from under the water. We also catch organized gangs, sometimes disguised in our uniforms. They have the task of disrupting communications, blowing up bridges and roads, killing our officers. And today, continued the lieutenant colonel, we brought an Estonian defector who says only one thing: the fascists will attack the Soviets in 2 days. If, he says, I'm lying, shoot me on the 3rd day. We were warned about the same thing in the last few days in various ways and from various places. We received letters from people who apparently sincerely wished the Soviet country well. Our self-sacrificing friends crossed the border at the risk of their lives to warn us of the impending trouble. My old colleague, Captain 1st Rank M. Vorontsov, our naval attaché in Germany, reported the same to Moscow through the diplomatic line. We took some measures on our own initiative. I remember the day of June 19th, 1941, when the Military Council of the Baltic Fleet decided to put the fleet on high operational readiness. Having written down the commander's instructions in my workbook, I wanted to leave, but the admiral detained me. He called Moscow and summoned the People's Commissar of the Navy, N.G. Kuznetsov. "Comrade People's Commissar," said Tributes, "I have formed the opinion that a German attack is possible at any hour. We must start putting up barriers, otherwise it will be too late. I consider it necessary to increase the operational readiness of the fleet." Hanging up the phone, the admiral sighed with relief. With an increase in operational readiness of the fleet agreed, but ordered to be careful, do not get involved in provocations, and with the setting of mines told to wait. "Let's do it." I flew back to my quarters. G.E. Pilipovsky, head of the operations department, was already waiting for me. "Well?" "Everything is in order, declare readiness number 2. In a few minutes our headquarters house was filled with business bustle. Readiness number 2 is not yet a combat alert, but there was a lot to do. In the courtyard hummed cars. Commanders of the so-called first echelon of the headquarters hastily took out suitcases and briefcases with operational documents. Sailors were loading property. Everything was done quickly, on the run, because there was a certain time limit for moving to the shore command post. People realized that this was no longer a drill. All headquarters and institutions of the fleet moved to the command posts. The rear were preparing to supply the ships with everything they needed. We had a short party meeting. Communists' headquarters discussed their tasks. The situation was difficult, clearly smelled of gunpowder. It was not necessary to explain it to the comrades. Secretary of the party organization reminded about vigilance. Fascist agents had already spread the most ridiculous rumors in the city, trying, first of all, to influence the families of servicemen and sow panic in their ranks. I also received anonymous mean-spirited letters, written in style and syllable by an obviously non-Russian hand. The fifth column was raising its head. Almost all the communists of the headquarters, both commanders and sailors, spoke at the meeting. Anger and hatred for the enemy, readiness to give their lives for their beloved motherland, for our party sounded in every word. Our hearts were filled with the deepest faith in the rightness of our cause, in the great power of the country of socialism. We assure the party that there will be no mercy for the enemy. If fascism dares to attack us, it will find its doom in our waters. So finished his brief speech Petty Officer First Article Ivakin, a modest, blue-eyed peasant lad. How stern and majestic he was at those moments. The stars were already fading in the bright night sky over the Baltic when we left the meeting. The earth, heated by the June sun, was breathing warmth. I could not believe it. Is there really a war tomorrow? At 16 hours and 15 minutes, the Red Banner Baltic Fleet switched to operational readiness number 2. June 20th and 21 passed relatively quietly. Even much less German merchant ships were detected in the sea, and for some reason they went unguarded. Alarming, however, the message that some Soviet steamships detained at the exit from German ports under various delicate pretexts that delayed the registration of documentation. The port authorities asked to take an additional insignificant cargo. Our plans always stipulated that defensive mine barriers should be put up immediately when a threat of war arose, in order to preempt the enemy and prevent his submarines and minesweepers from gaining access to the Gulf of Finland. This also applied to the approaches to the Moonsund Islands, bases and the entrance to the Gulf of Riga. However, we were categorically forbidden to lay mines without special permission. More than once I had to have telephone conversations with Admiral L. M. Gala, Deputy People's Commissar of the Navy. Comrade Pantilayev, be careful in everything, he invariably reminded me. What mines are you planning to put there? Don't give in to provocations, and please don't make any noise before the time. Before time. Or maybe it's already too late. During the whole day of June 21st, from Hanko and Riga, the fleet commander received reports and messages, imbued with the desire to give the provocateurs a hard slap on the wrist. The commander of the Libava naval base, Captain First Rank Emesquizin. Klavensky insistently asked for permission to open at least a warning fire on German planes appearing over the base. The commander gave a telegram to all commanders of compounds. It pointed out that the provocations of the Nazis in the areas of our naval bases and territorial waters do not stop, that it is necessary to increase vigilance and strengthen combat training. Talk less about the military danger and do more to raise the combat effectiveness of ships. These words ended the telegram. These instructions came to the ships, standing in Libava, at dawn on June 22nd, at the moment when they were already bombed by German aviation. Alarming reports followed one after another. We already knew that Finland had announced mobilization. Any minute now we were waiting by telephone or telegraph for the dreaded word war. About midnight I was urgently summoned by the commander. Its done flashed a thought. In his office was already a member of the military council of the Fleet Divisional Commissar M.G. Yakovenko. Vice Admiral Tributes sat back in his chair and nervously tapped his knee with a long pencil. This was the only thing that gave away his excitement. Now spoke on the phone with the People's Commissar. He told me without any preamble. Tonight we must expect a German attack on us. I ran back to my place, and in a few minutes the necessary instructions were already being transmitted to the fleet connections, to the aviation headquarters, and to the chief of the rear. At 23 hours 37 minutes on June 21st, 1941, the Red Banner Baltic Fleet was declared Operational Readiness No. 1. And it did not mean war yet, but already obliged to repel any attack with fire. On the approaches to the main base of the fleet additionally installed close ship watch. The first to go on the line was the base minesweeper Cramble, and at sea and in the air seemed calm. Alarming reports were less than in previous days. The calm before the storm joked the duty officers of the staff posts. That night no one lay down, no one slept. The coastal flagship command post, where at midnight moved to the full complement of the military council and fleet headquarters, was located near the seashore. Here, far from the city, it was quite quiet. The sea was damp and cool, and the aroma of uncut grasses came from the nearby fields. The white June night was passing imperceptibly into the morning twilight. At 1 hour 40 minutes on June 22nd, I reported to the Chief of the General Naval Staff. Fleet and bases transferred to Operational Readiness No. 1. In the course of events, it was already felt that in the coming days the fleet would be concentrated in Riga and Tallinn. It was urgently necessary to bring there an additional amount of fuel. Major General Mitrofan Ivanovich Moskalenko, head of the rear of the fleet, reported his calculations to the commander. At midnight they asked the People's Commissar for permission for the tanker Железнодорожник, with a full stock of fuel oil taken in Libava, to immediately proceed to US Divinsk and tanker No. 11 from Kronstadt to Tallinn. Already by 2 o'clock the consent came from Moscow. At the same time we were allowed to spend mobilization stocks. To the commander of the Libava base I passed the commander's order, all the remaining M-type submarines, except for sentries, to be transferred immediately to US Divinsk, and the rest to Vindava. The commander of the naval base Hanko was ordered to transfer all submarines and torpedo boats to Poldiski. This was envisaged in our plans. In Tallinn there were several new ships which had almost finished their state tests. It was decided to accept them into the fleet and to raise the Navy flag on them in the morning. Less ready ships were urgently sent to Leningrad to the factories. The shipbuilders, of course, were outraged. They were accustomed to the fact that the fleet command takes all measures depending on it to ensure factory, and even more so state tests of new ships. And today suddenly, and even at night, a laconic order: all tests are stopped, immediately proceed to Leningrad. I had to go to the ships and explain the situation to the chief delivery engineer A.V. Sidorenko. All the ships reached their factories safely and were already accepted by the fleet during the war. Our sentries are silent. Does it mean that everything is calm at sea? At about 1 a.m., a telegram came from the People's Commissar of the Navy. It warned that during June 22nd to 23rd a sudden attack of the Germans was possible, which could begin with provocative actions. Therefore, the People's Commissar demanded vigilance, caution, and again warned: do not give in to provocations. The telegram forbade reconnaissance in foreign waters and any active actions without Moscow's permission, including the setting of defensive mines. On Sunday, June 22nd, at 4 a.m., the first bombs fell on our cities and naval bases. Hordes of the enemy invaded the Soviet land. At 4:50 a.m. We were informed from Libava by Captain First Rank Klevinsky. Bombs fell on the military town and in the area of the airfield. There is no special damage. Report of Captain Second Rank FV. Zozuli from the Kronstadt base. 16 mines were dropped at the entrance to the Kronstadt raid. The waterway remained clear. The telephones kept ringing, reporting silhouettes of unknown ships, periscopes of submarines, dropped parachutists, airborne landings. What was not reported on that first night of the war, in its first hours. It was not a stream, but a waterfall of reports. All of them had to be analysed to select truth from fiction, and as soon as possible, because in wartime is everything. As you know, Hitler decided to attack the Soviet Union at 4 o'clock on June 22nd, but some of his generals departed from the German punctuality, violated the order of the Führer, and began hostilities before the deadline. The Chief of Staff of the Kronstadt base, Captain Second Rank FV. Zozulia reported that our transport Luga, coming from Hanko, was on the approach to Kronstadt, was suddenly shelled by Nazi planes at 3 hours and 30 minutes. The ship received 20 holes. There were wounded among the crew. More tragic was the fate of the Latvian steamer Geismar, which was going to Germany with timber. At 3:20 a.m., being near the Swedish island of Gotland, it was fired on from 4 fascist boats without any warning, and then torpedoed twice. The blast wave threw most of the crew overboard. Nazi boats shot sailors swimming in the water, mortally wounded the captain and many crew members. But the crew behaved heroically. At the last moment, radio operator Stepan Savitsky managed to broadcast a radiogram torpedoed. Geismar is sinking. Farewell 24 people. Among them were wounded. On a rescue Velbot in 14 hours reached our shore at the Ujava lighthouse. There they buried the ship's captain, the communist Nikolai Georgievich Duve, whose body the sailors had delivered to their native land. The long vaulted room is the paternoster of the coastal battery, which stood here back in the First World War. Along the walls are tables of operators, and in the middle large tables of furnishings with maps laid out on them. My desk is at the very entrance. Lots of light. It's noisy, though the officers speak in low voices and the phones ring faintly. This is the fleet's shore command centre. 4 hours and 50 minutes. VF. Tributes walks quickly to his desk, raises a tired look at me, and takes his favourite large pencil. I silently handed him the telegram form. Vice Admiral slowly reads aloud. Germany has launched an attack on our bases and ports. By force of arms to repel the enemy. Sighing, he puts his sprawling signature. Officer Kashin takes the telegram. Soon it went over the wires and airwaves in Hanko, Riga, on the island of Isel, in Kronstadt to formations, units and ships. Strange thing is that we breathed a sigh of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from our shoulders. The unknown was over. Everything was in its place. Now we had to act. The telegraph key was tapping hastily under the hand of the young frowning petty officer. Having given orders, the commander went to the harbour. To the ships at these moments he wanted to be among the sailors and officers. I went out into the air. It was already dawning. The sea was quiet. A tugboat with a barge was puffing in the Surop Strait, heading for Tallinn. Its sailors were in a hurry to get home. They know nothing about the war yet. There were rallies on the ships and in the units. Sailors and officers swore to fulfill their duty to the motherland. Non-partisan applied to the party, wanted to go into battle as communists. Orders came from the headquarters. We're taking the exam. Everything that we prepared, calculated, estimated, today will be tested in action. Flag Navigator Captain Second Rank Iosifov reported that all beacons are extinguished, floating fence is removed from the banks and shoals. White, red, green lights will no longer flash friendly to ships on the sea expanses. Tripled art of ship navigation will be required of commanders and navigators. Arrived head of intelligence Lieutenant Colonel N.S. Frumkin. He reported that the Nazis openly, on the radio, announced the mining of the sea between the islands of Eland and the port of Klaipeda. Captain Lieutenant Lukyanchikov quickly put the data on the map, shook his head. That's across the entire southern part of the Baltic. It can't be. Obviously another fascist fake. The head of the operations department, as if continuing the thought of the officer-operator, expressed a guess. They are trying to delay the deployment of our submarines in the Baltic Sea. As it turned out later, it was so the Nazis put 3,000 mines and mine defenders in this area, and yet they could not prevent the deployment of our submarines. I received a stream of reports, inquiries, requests, gave orders. There were many difficulties, mainly because mobilization had not yet been announced, and civilian organizations continued to work in a peaceful manner. Captain Second Rank Ivan Nikolaevich Gantsov, our head of the military communications department, was continuously calling the Baltic Shipping Company and the commercial port, demanding to allocate the necessary vessels for the fleet. But no one listened to him, because there were no instructions from above. The director of the theatre called, asking is it possible to play a play today. The sponsored school was worried should the pioneer camps be shut down. Where to put the civilian university students who had recently arrived in Tallinn for an internship. The word war was slowly being introduced into people's consciousness and everyday life. The last thing we wanted and intended to do was to go to war. As the song said, we are peaceful people, but our armoured train is standing on the reserve track. However, it was not so easy to separate the pairs of this armoured train. Only after the destruction of the transport Geismar, under our energetic pressure, the shipping company ordered all its ships to immediately go to the nearest Soviet ports. Fortunately, 2 steamships Lunacharsky and Second Five-Year Plan, going to Germany, managed to return back. The fate of our sailors who were in Germany at that time was tragic. Unfortunately, not considering the tense situation, the People's Commissariat of the Navy sent dozens of its sailors on a business trip to Germany just a few days before the Nazi attack. Our transports with cargoes also went there. In the first hours of the war, the fascists arrested and sent to concentration camps about 900 Soviet sailors. The enemy captured more than 40 Soviet ships with a total tonnage of over 123,000 tons. German ships and German specialists, as already mentioned, timely left our ports and met the war at home. At the command post arrived to receive instructions commanders of compounds. One of the first to appear was a tall, thin Rear Admiral D.D. Vidovichenko, commander of the squadron, always calm and direct in judgment. His bassy voice was heard from afar and was lost only in front of the juicy bass of the head of the rear of the fleet, Major General Michigan Moskalenko. Greeted and modestly sat down on a chair, Captain First Rank N.I., Meshchersky, commander of the minesweeper OK. Almost immediately after him came the commander of the water area protection of the main base, Captain Second Rank A. Mileshkin. I looked at these long, familiar faces. The same smiles, the same greetings, only very few words. Everyone approached the officer-operator and received documents. In the silence rustled cards, tracing paper. Rear Admiral Vidovichenko, having looked through the documents, neatly stacked them in a folder, tied it, and, noisily slamming on it with a wide palm, rumbled his bass. Chief of Staff. Everything is clear to me, permission to proceed, and immediately disappeared. Fleet aviation, coastal defence, rear of the fleet and naval bases kept operational documentation in place. Fleet headquarters gave these compounds only a signal, and there immediately opened special packages. Therefore, the arrival at the BFCP chief of the rear of the fleet, Major General Emil I. Moskalenko worried me. He sat aside and wrote something, counted. This was my old friend from my service on the Black Sea in the distant years of my youth. Moskalenko knew well the economy of the fleet, led it promptly and confidently, always knew the situation, and was able to maintain the closest contact in the work of the rear with the fleet headquarters. Having caught my questioning look, Mitrofan Ivanovich made a calming gesture with his hand. Nothing. It's all right, the machine turned and in the rear. But I have a serious conversation to have. Let all the flagmen go, I'll wait. I was wary, knowing that for small things Moskalenko never turned to the headquarters too independent man. Called the Chief of Staff Aviation Colonel D. Surkov. Airplanes flew on reconnaissance in the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea. I rejoiced. Finally, Now we cannot reproach us that we fly to the provocation. The duty officers of the staff posts reported submarines began to go to the positions bombing aviation is flying out to strike back at the fascist naval bases. Finally, almost all the flagships dispersed. "Let's go to the air, we need to consult," said General Moskalenko. We came out of the hole. Moskalenko immediately began what he was worried about. The plan of mine laying in the Abensky Strait does not change. Everything remains as planned. Why do you ask? There is not enough fuel in US Divinsk, where the ships are supposed to go for mine laying. The tanker Zhelezno-Dorozhnik is bringing it from Libava, but it hasn't gone halfway there yet. Yes, it makes you think. That's when the lack of fuel storage facilities had an impact. It is too late and useless to find out who is to blame now. We have to do something immediately. Returning to the command post, we made calculations on the map. There was a proposal to send a tanker to the road Kurezar and 4 destroyers with mines barrier to come here on the existing stock of fuel in order to make here a full refueling. So we'll save almost 24 hours of time, reported to the fleet commander. He once again checked all our calculations, sharply threw his big pencil on the map. All instructions aside, huh? The fact is that ships with mines on board were strictly forbidden to take fuel. That's the way it used to be. But the unwritten laws of war were inexorably coming into their own. Shaking his head, Vladimir Filipovich still had to sign the order. It was getting damp and stuffy in the hole. Change duty operators, but they did not go to rest, and after drinking a glass of strong tea, returned to their posts, helping their comrades. There was too much work. The fleet commander showed up briefly to receive reports and give instructions, and then left again. He had time to visit the ships, and at the meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Council of Ministers of the Republic. The country was going to war. The fleet was already taking in its ranks thousands of soldiers and reserve commanders, as well as more than 200 ships from the merchant and fishing fleets. At 6:30 we received an instruction from Moscow. The fleet immediately begin setting up defensive mine barriers according to the cover plan. After lunch I was summoned by the commander and silently held out a form with the text of an emergency telegram from the chief of the main naval staff. We were ordered to put mines around the clock, use everything you can, destroyers and leaders. We were going to do that until 2 days ago. And now the fleet didn't need a nudge. The complex machinery of minesweeping had spun up and was running at full speed. Some time later, I spoke by VHF with the Deputy People's Commissar of the Navy, Admiral L.M. Gala. It was a tactful, charming man. Wise, great worldly experience. He served in the Tsarist Navy. Gala was characterized by the greatest punctuality and performance. And this time he was in a hurry to transmit the order received from above. Comrade Pantalayev, it is necessary to take all measures for quick setting of barrier mines. Please report it to the Comflot. Yes, I'll report, I said, and couldn't help myself. Lev Mikhailovich, how many times we asked permission to start mine laying? But we were refused. And now they are rushing from all sides, as if we do not understand anything. Gala interrupted me. Listen, my dear, let's not go into details now. This is later, and now I ask you earnestly to report to the Comflot and act faster. That was the end of our conversation. Of course, it was very annoying that we start mine laying a day after the war started, and not a day before it started, as it was supposed according to the plans of the fleet headquarters. Preempting the enemy and surprise attack has always been considered by the art of war as the most important factor of success in war, especially at the beginning of the war. And now the enemy has preempted us. And yet, despite the suddenness of the attack of Nazi Germany, the Red Banner Baltic Fleet was not taken by surprise. It quickly deployed and began active combat operations. At 18 o'clock on June 22nd, a detachment of ships consisting of the cruiser Maxim Gorky and 3 destroyers Gordy, Wrathful, Sterigushi left Ust-Divinsk under the command of Captain 2nd Rank I.G. Svyatov. The task of the detachment was to cover mine laying in the mouth of the Gulf of Finland. The ships sailed without minesweepers, relying only on their Paravan Guardians. There were no fast minesweepers in Riga. 2 old Latvian minesweepers could squeeze no more than 6 knots with trawls. A detachment of ships following them at such speed would not be able to arrive in time to the assigned area. In addition, at such a low-speed cruiser and destroyers could become a perfect target for enemy submarines. To argue about why the Navy began the war without the necessary number of fast minesweepers, it was too late. It remained to risk, but to fulfill the combat mission. The command post became quiet. A stream of the first reports came down. White night transparent smoky blanket enveloped the sea and the shore. The silence was soothing. I lay down on the couch and dozed off. Tired brain does not perceive the muffled talk of duty operators and phone calls. But as soon as I hear the words about the enemy's appearance, some invisible relay closes at once, and the drowsiness is gone. That's what happened when I heard the question of the duty officer. Where is the submarine? Who's ours or the enemy's? I jumped up and went to the map. Here is the submarine detected in a surface position, as reported by the patrol ship and the observation post on the island of Nassau. And all at once, as at the stroke of a conductor's wand in an orchestra, the telephones started working. Duty Staff Headquarters, Coastal Defence, Communication Service, Water Area Protection, Submarine Brigade reported the same thing. A submarine appeared in the area of the main base. There were requests on the radio. Shone searchlights from the islands. The battery on Nassau opened fire. Watch boats reported attack submarine. The airplane flew out, reported detected a submarine, pursuing, directing boats. The commander takes the phone, calls the commander of the submarine brigade. Whose boat is it? Turns out it's ours, the M90. Goes to a position in the Gulf of Finland. The commander decided to refuel the battery at sea, but did not calculate, came too close to our island. Chief of Staff. Hanging up the phone, the commander says to me, "Sort out this silly story in detail, and that this will not happen again. And for the vigilance of observation should be encouraged, people." He's right. The commander of the protection of the water area of the main base, Captain Second Rank A. Mileshkin, the commanders of his patrol boats, signallers at observation posts, pilots and battery men are certainly worthy of praise. A kind of test of protection of the approaches to the main base undoubtedly brought benefit, but of course had to take measures to eliminate in the future similar mishaps. At midnight, Rear Admiral Vitovychenko went out with his detachment of ships to set the central mine barrier in the mouth of the Gulf of Finland. Creation of the mine position was planned to be realized in a few days. During the day, the ships were to receive mines in Tallinn. At night, they were to go out to lay them, although our white nights were not much different from the gloomy day. In all, several thousand barrage mines were laid. The entrance to the Gulf of Finland was securely closed. The barrage detachment consisted of 2 mine barriers, Oka and Ural, leaders Leningrad and Minsk, destroyers Karl Marx, Artem and Volodarsky. Direct protection of the detachment from mines and submarines of the enemy performed 3 basic minesweepers, several boats Hunters and Destroyer Bold. Bomber and fighter regiments from Tallinn were ready to cover the ships from the air. The place of the planned mine laying was pre-trailed. No mines were found in the area. As it turned out later, the fascists put their barriers to the west. 20 of our submarines went out into the Baltic Sea. New echelons of boats were preparing to follow them. At the FKP continued to live a busy life. Telephones were ringing. Telegraph machines were tapping away. Leaning over the maps, operators were working concentratedly, noting the movement of our and enemy ships. From the first days of the war, the fleet aviation was active. On June 24th, I received a call from the commander of the Fleet Air Forces, General V. Ermochenkov. Comrade Chief of Staff, the fascists no longer have the naval base Memel. Where did it go? We bombed everything there. Indeed, the control aerial images confirmed that the enemy had dealt the strongest blow to this naval base. No sooner had we studied its results properly than we received an order from Moscow, in cooperation with the air forces of the army and the Northern Fleet, to destroy the fascist aviation at the airfields of Finland. According to intelligence, it threatened Leningrad, the Baltic and Northern fleets. On June 25th, early in the morning, 90 Navy bomber planes bombed the airfield of Turku. The next day they repeated the strike. The airfield was destroyed. The enemy could not use it for a long time. In the next days, the fleet aviation bombed Kotka, Porvo and other airfields. All in all, about 250 airplane sorties were made during this period. The enemy suffered great damage. Unfortunately, in the future, the fleet aviation did not have to work much on the sea direction. The difficult situation at the front near Riga required our urgent assistance to the land units, and the entire fleet bomber aviation, by order of the Stavka, began to operate on the boundary of the river Daugava. The difficulty was that the naval pilots had no experience in bombing land targets. In addition, our bombers had to fly during daylight hours and without fighter cover. We lost men and combat vehicles. And yet the Baltic pilots successfully accomplished their tasks. The 1st Mine Torpedo, 37th and 73rd Bomber Regiments, which numbered more than 100 airplanes, day after day successfully bombed enemy crossings on the Daugava River. An immortal feat was performed by a bomber pilot Junior Lieutenant P.S. Igashev. In the battle his plane caught fire, the fire could not be extinguished. Then the pilot on the blazing machine rammed the Nazi plane, and together with it crashed into a tank column of the enemy. Shocked, we read a brief report about it, the headquarters of the Fleet Air Force. In the fierce struggle, heroes were born. At sea, the initiative was in our hands. The enemy could not disrupt neither the deployment of our submarines in the Baltic Sea, nor the setting of defensive mine barriers in the Gulf of Finland. His first airstrikes on our bases were also unsuccessful. The situation on the land front was quite different. Parts of the Baltic military district could not hold back the superior forces of the enemy. Great losses were suffered by the fighter aviation of the front in the first days of the war. It lost more than 200 airplanes. Therefore, the deployment of land units were no longer covered from the air. We in the fleet headquarters did not know all this and could not understand why the enemy is so rapidly advancing. From Libava already reported that heard the rumble of artillery cannonade. And the matter was as follows. Our troops failed to create a solid front. Heroic resistance of some land units could not stop the enemy. The Nazis flowed around them from the flanks. Enemy tanks broke deep into our rear. Communication was broken, headquarters were cut off from their troops, and sometimes did not realize the complexity of the situation. We received only fragmentary data received by telephone from Moscow and Leningrad. They were contradictory and therefore even more alarming. Later we learned that by the evening of June 22nd, the enemy had expanded the breakthrough along the front to 130 kilometers. By the end of the 4th day of the war, the Nazis had moved deeper into our territory for more than 200 kilometers. The 8th Army was forced to withdraw to avoid being surrounded. Thus, the main task of the covering armies to delay the enemy during the deployment of our main forces was unfulfilled. I remember how bitterly joked in the fleet headquarters, well, one war plan can be handed over to the archives, he fought back. And we spent so much time and effort to coordinate all the details of close cooperation between the 8th Army and the Navy. And then there are other complications. Somewhere local civilian authorities showed unnecessary haste. Rear Admiral P.A. Trainin informed us with anxiety that the local authorities ordered to begin evacuation of cargo from the port of Riga. This makes the population nervous. Azargi Latvian fascists shooting from roofs and attics. Pavel Alexeyevich Trainin, the commander of our Baltic naval base, of course, did not have any instructions about evacuation and did not intend to leave his base on the first day of the war. He was preparing to provide mine laying in the urban strait. But the atmosphere in the city was becoming more and more alarming. By evening we learned that the district headquarters, which had been reorganized into the headquarters of the Northwestern Front, had urgently left Riga. On June 25th it became known that Finland had entered the war. This circumstance did not surprise us in the least. The whole policy of the Finnish government led to that. Now it became even more difficult for us. The command and headquarters of the Baltic Fleet, being in Tallinn, henceforth had to manage not only the defence of the Gulf of Riga and the Gulf of Finland, but also the operations in the eastern part of the Gulf of Finland and near Viborg. All communications linking the main base of the fleet with other bases were under the continuous and direct impact of the enemy from the air and from the sea from the Finnish skerries. Hanko and Kronstadt entered the battle. The naval base on the Hanko Peninsula rented by us after the war with Finland, was established only in the spring of 1940. Now the peninsula became a mighty outpost of our defence. Of course, we did not have time to complete all the planned works on Hanko within a year. But, looking ahead, I will say that the deficiencies in the engineering equipment of the base were covered by the courage of the soldiers and commanders of the garrison. Organised and rallied a glorious team of Gangushans Base Commander Major General S.I. Kabanov and Brigade Commissioner A.L.L. Raskin. They were talented people. Sergei Ivanovich Kabanov was a major specialist of coastal artillery, brought up in the spirit of the best traditions of Baltic sailors. Kabanov's authority was exceptionally great. He was loved for his businesslike behavior, care about people, for his calmness, in which the will of an experienced commander was felt. In all respects to match General Kabanov was, and Brigade Commissar Arseny Ruskin. I remembered Ruskin as a sailor, submarine motorist. We served together in our youth on the Black Sea. An excellent submariner, Ruskin knew well the soul of the sailor, able to inspire people, lead them to the feet. Management of the various forces of the base provided well-matched staff officers literate in land and sea issues. Headed by the base staff captain second rank, P.G. Maximov. By the beginning of the war, the number of the Peninsula garrison did not exceed 25,000 people, which included land, sea, engineering and construction units. The base had field, railroad and stationary long-range artillery, naval aviation and light fleet forces. The operational importance of the base in the defence of the Gulf of Finland was very great. Together with the powerful batteries of Osmasar and Dago Islands, the batteries of Hanko created a strong artillery position that blocked the entrance to the Gulf of Finland and covered our central mine barrier. Relying on Hanko, it was easier for us to act on the enemy's sea communications. The entry of Finland into the war led to the fact that in the rear of our position facing west, there was a new enemy German and Finnish naval forces based on the southern coast of Finland, in close proximity to the main fleet base and along our most important communication tunnel in Kronstadt. There was no need for them to force the central mine position created by us, because they were deployed before the war in the Skerries, in our rear. Kronstadt, considered the rear base of the fleet, on the third day of the war was on the front line, turned into a fire shield Leningrad. With the fire of its forts and ships, it assisted our land units in the Vyborg direction, organised sea landings in the rear of the enemy, covered Leningrad from enemy air raids from the sea direction. Kronstadt Fortress again stood up to defend the city of Great Lenin, the cradle of the revolution. The flow of reports, oral and written, was growing. Operators barely had time to read them, check them, write them in the logs, and put them on the map. Here an officer rereads some report several times, shows it to the head of the operations department, Captain First Rank Pilipovsky. Both of them confer about something, and finally come to my desk. "Quite a strange message from the Sneese district," says Pilipovsky. I read, "Posts on the north shore of Dago Island during the night heard German radio conversations on ultrashort waves. The essence of the conversations did not catch. What do you think it means?" Both of them look at me questioningly. "It means a lot of things," I say. Apparently the German ships were at night at the mouth of the Gulf of Finland. Check again if the corresponding reports from the patrol ships. We dug through a pile of radiograms. We found nothing. We met each new message with impatience. And only at 16 o'clock came the first news from the patrol minesweeper BTSHT H-216. From the mouth of the Gulf of Finland, the commander of the ship reported that in the morning, 10 miles northwest of Cape Torkuna minesweeper found a mine bank, his paravan undercut 2 mines. One of them exploded, the other shot. There was no doubt that fascist ships had visited the mouth of the Gulf of Finland during the night and put up mines. By evening, a turbo-electric ship arrived from Hanko to Tallinn, carrying 5,000 women and children evacuated from the peninsula. This ship was escorted by the destroyer Bold. Almost near our shores, northwest of Pakri Lighthouse, the destroyer picked up a mine with a paravan. It exploded near the board, fortunately without causing serious damage. The second detection of mines on the approaches to our bases in one day required urgent measures. It was necessary to trawl both the approach fairways and the area of our planned mine laying. But with what? We had only 11 basic minesweepers for the whole fleet. There were 5 of them in Tallinn, and 1 of them was on watch. It's clear that it's impossible to trawl all the fairways reliably with such forces in one day, so to risk the ships again,